Good morning once again. So on the second Sabbath, we've been going through a series, and we've been following two destitute widows. Naomi, an aged Bethlehemite, whose sons also passed on, and Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law, who had no children also. So after some dramatic turns of events, we finally came to the decisive moment last time. Who would be willing to save them from their plight? Whatever sacrifice one must make for them. And after a tactical transaction, Boaz, the one we were rooting for, came out a redeemer. Although no profits could be expected from this deal that they made, Boaz wanted to pay the full price to restore these two widows to their status quo. I said that redemption is determined by the situation of the ones in need of redemption, not the redeemers. And a redeemer is someone who wills to go all the way to meet the needs of the others. And therefore, we concluded redemption is situational. Now, let's pick up the story where we left off. Ruth chapter 4, verse 9. So the contender, having conceded to the agreement, Boaz said to the elders and all the people. Now, as you might remember, this legal proceeding took place not in a closed courtroom, but in public, outdoor, and possibly in the middle of the town's open plaza. Right? So at first, there were only Boaz, John Doe, the original redeemer, and the city's 10 elders. But now, apparently, there was a crowd surrounding them. Right? The passers-by were drawn to what was happening there. They were interested in how things would turn out. And so to these people, Boaz said, these people, not only the elders, but also including the randomly gathered assembly, you are witnesses this day. They were not mere bystanders or observers anymore. They were witnesses to the significant event that just transpired. They were called upon to ratify the agreement that they came to. You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Kilion and to Machlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Machlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. Now, this latter purchase of Ruth was crucial if Boaz's intention was to redeem the dying family, rather than to strike a good deal for his own gain. Right? Because only if Ruth could give birth to a boy, as Elimelech's descendant, Elimelech was Naomi's late husband, the family could continue to live on in the land given by God. And what Boaz is doing here is akin to what's called a levirate marriage. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but levirate marriage. Basically put, in levirate marriage, a brother marries his late brother's widow to give birth to a son who would carry the late brother's name and family onward. Right? So the son that is being born will not be this second brother's son, but the late brother's. Right? And although neither Boaz nor a redeemer in general was legally required to perform a levirate marriage, again, redemption is situational as such, right? And the situation called for some kind of a levirate arrangement, or at least that's what Boaz, as well as John Doe, saw it. Right? To preserve Elimelech's family and his land, his family had to be raised. And therefore, Boaz gave not only his money to purchase the land, but also himself, his life, right, to bring back to life this dying family. And what what the people there witnessed was Boaz's determination and commitment to such a redemption. You are witnesses this day, he said again. Now, I think even us living today, we get the importance of having a witness, right? And I think we imagine, well, as Christians, we have a different meaning of witness, perhaps, but in general, we have a court setting in mind, I believe, right? But, I imagine that the role of witness may have been more important back in those days. And why I say that is because today, we have video recordings, audio recordings, everything important is documented in writing. And so that if questions or disputes may arise later, the future people may point back to the records and say, see this, right? But that wasn't always the case. Right? Back then, it was the people themselves who had to take the responsibility, right? By being truthful to what they saw, by taking notes in their minds and passing that on orally in words to the succeeding generations. It was the duty, witnessing was a duty of the townspeople to preserve and inherit this shared memory. Right? So, for example, in this case, in Ruth's case, if John Doe, the other potential redeemer, his descendants later changed their mind and made a claim to the land as once being closest to Elimelech's family, the townspeople would have to, in that generation, in the future generation, the townspeople would have to testify against them and say, well, your ancestor, John Doe, agreed to Boaz buying it. As their forefathers and foremothers witnessed the event with their own eyes, the sons and daughters were to bear witness to the truthfulness of the reports that they've been given. So in that sense, witnessing was a multi-generational commitment to truth. And as modern people, we might have difficulty understanding this because all the information we need is, we think, at our fingertips, right? We've mostly delegated the responsibility to the devices that we have to do all the fact-checking and even remembering. Right? And I'm not against technology per se. There's some good, of course. But I'm also, I also sometimes wonder, or I'm concerned, if I be honest, that that's making us, in a way, myopic, unable to imagine beyond my lifetime, and altering the past to better suit our moment. I hope you get what I'm trying to say here, but it's so easy. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm pointing my finger to myself also. It's easy to forget the past, right? Whether in simple amnesia style or deliberately rewriting the past for our convenience. Right? So in this day and age dubbed as post-truth era, maybe we're called up to once again take up this responsibility to be witnesses, right? To observe with enlightened eyes, to testify to the truth, and to inherit that memory to our progeny. Right? But I sort of digress. So to Boaz called to be witnesses, here's the people's reaction. All the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses." Right? And it's a shame to say, but as I was preparing for this sermon, I just learned that in biblical Hebrew, which I took at least a year and a half courses back in undergrad. In biblical Hebrew, there's no word for yes. I finally found that out. Right? So literally translated, they simply said witnesses, right? In acceptance of their role as called for by Boaz. But, and this to me is the interesting and important part, they didn't accept their role as witnesses by merely affirming what they've witnessed. And this, I think, is what adds to their witnessing a spiritual aspect or even spiritual depth. That is, they went further than affirming the facts by pronouncing blessings upon what they'd just seen. Their act of witnessing involved, in a simple term, prayer. And this is crucial for our purpose for this series because, in case you've forgotten, our series is entitled God on the Lips. Now, the reason why I chose that title, I know it sounds weird, is because in the book of Ruth, God shows up rarely in the scene, right? But he does show up quite often on the lips of the people, in the words that people use, whether it's the characters praying or blessing or even, in a way, cursing, they use the name of God. Right? And so in this book, the narrator, for the most part, neither mentions God nor poses to have a God's eye view over the story. We're not exactly told how God was actually involved in these people's lives. But people in this story called upon God's name, believing that he was involved in their lives, believing that he was at work, whether for their good or for bad. And this, I'd say, is somewhat relatable to us as well. And that's that I say because, all these spectacular stories in the Bible of these biblical heroes and heroines audibly hearing God's voice, being visited by angels, seeing miracles, or even performing one, they might impress us, but also possibly put us at a distance because that's not how many of us usually encounter or interact with God. Right? And there must be a note here that I must admit that for some of us, that might be the experience. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but I believe for most of us, that's not. Right? And of course, we still believe that God can do such wondrous things even today. We believe that God is still involved in our lives, however vague and spotty his involvement may seem to us. Right? But, and this is the point, when you think about it, God does appear constantly, and he seems to be quite active even to this day on our lips. Right? God is still closest to us when we invoke, when we call upon his name to ask or thank, to confess or to blame, or to bless or curse. Right? God is not so much behind the scenes. Right? He is in the words we utter, as was the case in this story in the book of Ruth. And that's why it's important to attend to our words, right? To people's words in which God's name is mentioned, that is, prayers. So the question is, what did these witnesses pray in invoking God's name? The witnesses said, "May the Lord make the woman," that is Ruth, "who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel." So they prayed for Boaz directly and for Ruth indirectly. They wished that the Lord would make Ruth like Rachel and Leah. Now, Rachel and Leah were the wives of Jacob. Jacob later was renamed as Israel. So the Israelites, or Jews or Hebrews, whatever you'd like to call these people, were all descendants of Rachel and Leah. And there's in a parenthesis, and her maidservants, who gave birth as their surrogates. So Rachel and Leah may rightly be called the matriarchs who gave birth to and mothered the 12 tribes of Israel. And when you think about that, it's quite striking that these witnesses, the Israelites, likened Ruth, the Moabite, to their foremothers. Right? It's surprising, especially if you remember that back before there were any Israelites, the forefather, Jacob or Israel, married Rachel and Leah following his father's command specifically not to marry a Gentile woman. And yet, his descendants, these witnesses, likened this foreigner to their forefathers. Likened not in the sense of finding similarities per se, but in wishing that this Moabite, this widow, and this woman, possibly infertile, to be like them, their foremothers, their matriarchs, in building up the house of Israel. Or in other words, in building up the house of theirs, right? And that's something. Ruth, the one who's been repeatedly referred to as the Moabite throughout in this book, is now obviously taken in to be as one of their own. And they continued, "May you, Boaz, act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." Again, Boaz is prayed for directly and Ruth indirectly. Boaz here is wished that he would act worthily, which literally meant that he acts as he is. Because if you remember, in this book, he was called a worthy man, right? And he's also wished that he be renowned, which is, again, curious, considering what Boaz had just committed himself to. He did everything he could to perpetuate his name? No. He did everything to perpetuate the name of the dead, that the name of the dead may not be cut off, even at the risk of losing his own name. Right? And that's why the other potential redeemer backed out. Right? But then the people wished for Boaz's name to be renowned, and Boaz's house to be like the house of Peretz, who, by the way, Peretz was their Bethlehemite forefather, it seems. So as Ruth was wished to be like the Israelites' matriarchs, the house of Boaz was wished to be like that of their own tribe's forefathers. That is, their house. But then what's further interesting or maybe even disturbing is a small additional explanation or a clause that's added there. Right? Be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Judah. And we ask, was that information necessary? Because I'm sure the witnesses, needed no reminder as to who bore Peretz, right? So why would they mention Peretz as being born by Tamar and Judah? Moreover, this story of Tamar and Judah giving birth to Peretz is not exactly the story that they would be proud of. It's not the most beautiful story you'd want to hear at your wedding, or God forbid, your marriage to be likened to. If I may kind of summarize this story, Tamar was married to Judah's firstborn, who was surprisingly killed by the Lord for his wickedness and leaving no heir. So, according to the Levirate marriage custom, Judah arranged for his second son to give birth with Tamar for his late-born son, or for his late firstborn son. Right? But then this second son also was killed for his wickedness, leaving no heir. Now, what would the father, Judah, think? Well, maybe this woman is too dangerous to give another son of my own to give away, right? So Judah hesitated to give her his third son. Now, sensing that her father-in-law had no more intention of having her in the family or giving his son to her, Tamar actually tricked him, Judah, her forefather, to lie with her, and the result was Peretz and Zerah, the other brother. Right? Well, I must say, I don't have to say, but honestly, I think it's quite messed up. But were there similarities between Tamar, Judah, and Ruth, Boaz? Well, sure. I mean, the least being both Tamar and Ruth widows with no children and later conceiving an heir or heirs through a levirate-like relationship with their relatives. That's a similarity, sure. But to my eyes, the similarities are more apparent than the dissimilarities are more apparent than the similarities. Morally speaking, at least, Ruth, Boaz seem to have done a lot better than Tamar and Judah. But having said that all, I'm also thinking that such comparisons and contrasts may be to miss the point, actually. Because if we go back to what the people were doing with their words in prayer, the people's concern or their wish was that the Lord give these two an offspring to establish the household, right? Just like the Lord did to their ancestors in ways that were nothing but likely and ordinary, right? So in that sense, the witnesses did not appeal to their Boaz and Ruth's character, however noble they may have been. They could have done that, but they didn't, right? Recognizing Yahweh as a source of blessing and family, they assumed that Boaz having offspring through Ruth depended on the divine gift. Thus, what the witnesses did by praying for Boaz and Ruth to be like this person or like that family, which was their own, was in a way to incorporate them into a larger narrative, even a divine narrative that they shared as a people of God. They were not simply accepting a foreigner into their country, but making her a part of their family history, connecting her, Ruth the Moabite, with their most significant family members and their own household. And how could that happen? How could a forging of these new relationships and the writing of a renewed history happen? Well, it was none other than the Lord to whom they prayed, who could make this all happen. It was the Lord who could not only carry on but flourish the names of Israel, Judah, Peretz, Elimelech, and even Boaz. It was the Lord who could establish the families of Leah, Rachel, Tamar, Naomi, and even Ruth as one of them. So what these praying witnesses did was, in a way, to situate this new couple, one of them even a foreigner and a heathen, maybe formerly, in a divine story that ran deeper than what their eyes could see. And in a way, to wrap up this sermon, I'd like to consider what this meant for Ruth, who we haven't seen for a while in this story, and for Ruth personally. Because she was now given a new story to live with and live in. Right? And if a narrative makes a character, then she's given even a new character or new, renewed identity even. Right? So she was no longer to be seen merely as a Moabite, but as a rightful successor of Rachel and Leah, the Israelites' matriarchs. She was no longer to be seen merely as Machlon's widow, but as Boaz's wife, whose household was prayed for to be established like Peretz. She was no longer to be seen merely as a childless widow, but as one who was wished by the whole townspeople to be given a child, like Tamar did, to whom many of them could trace their lineage. At one level, they were witnesses, a mere witnesses to legal proceeding that just took place. And they were bearing witnesses for the future generation. But at another level, as prayerful witnesses, they witnessed to a new story or a renewed story, and a new character or a renewed character made anew by the Lord. So as they witnessed a new connection that was made between Ruth and their past, they expectantly prayed for a new future for their people, for their own, as well as for Ruth, who was now also their own. So in the name of the Lord, Ruth was given a new story to inhabit, a new character to live. And that's what the witnesses did. And if I may make this a sermon and not just a Bible study, I'd say that is what we too as a church are called to do. As I think he's written beautifully, systematic theologian Kevin Hector called this a spiritual friendship. He wrote, "If I know that my friend, my spiritual friend, is reliable at perceiving things as God does, then it follows that this person is reliable at perceiving me too, as God does. And because they're close to me, they can perceive who I am deep down as God does. They can thus bear witness to me of the way that God perceives me, and of the fact that this perception, not my shamefulness, is that which is fundamentally true about me." If our spiritual friends, witnesses' opinion carries weight with me, I may be able to perceive myself in their perception of me, and in so doing, come to perceive myself in God's perception of me. And the church, I believe, is and ought to be a collective of such spiritual friends who sees you as God does, who witnesses to the new reality in you as God brought about. Sometimes we lose our way, right? Sometimes we even lose ourselves. And yet, when we feel at a loss, I believe it's the church that helps us resituate ourselves in the narrative being written by God. When we no longer know who we are, it's the church that helps us gather our shattered selves to realize ourselves as envisioned by God. And when we hit our dead ends, it's the church that prays for us, wishing that the Lord blesses us by opening up an abundantly flourishing future to come. That is, I believe, the church's call to be witnesses to the world. And it is my prayer, my sincerest prayer, that we are truthful witnesses. Like these elders and the randomly gathered bystanders who witnessed to what God had done in the lives of Ruth and Boaz, weaving together the old and new threads, connecting them with the past as a path for the future, and wishing for all the blessings from the Lord to be poured upon this new couple. Let's close with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this beautiful, sweet story, and for giving us an insight into what these randomly gathered townspeople did as witnesses. And it is our prayer that we too may be truthful and faithful witnesses to the world, to be able to see what you see and to proclaim what the truth is in your eyes. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.